Here we go. We're on. And welcome back, SEN peers. We're on, I think, week 5, 6, 7 with Ellen from Sojo. You're going to meet Ellen at the end of this wonderful adventure. Ellen, what's your background, and tell us what's on your business card?
Sure. Well, I guess I have to update my business card. But right now, I am the co-founder and CEO of Sojo. So that is an organization that I started 4 years ago now. Basically, we work with other organizations, so educational institutions and youth-serving organizations. We support them in developing social entrepreneurship programs for their communities. So I got into this work sort of coming from a background in the nonprofit sector, and then I was working at the Center for Impact Investing at Mars, where I saw that lots of people were interested in getting impact investing, but they were having trouble doing that. So whether that was kind of individual social entrepreneurs or nonprofit organizations. And so I wanted to really work on the issue of how do we build capacity of social innovators and social entrepreneurs so that they can get their great projects funded and get them to scale. So that is what brought me here.
Excellent. So one of the questions that we want to ask just to start this off is, so what is impact? You talk about impact investing, we talk about impact, and this is like a big word in the world of social enterprise. And can you just maybe give us a bit of your definition of, kind of what the textbook definition of impact is, but then also from your perspective, what real impact is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. It is such a big word, and I think that a lot of the conversation is about how do we get better at measuring impact, how can we prove impact. And so I would say, sort of at its simplest form, impact is the effect that an intervention has on people's lives, or the effect that an intervention has on stakeholders. I think it's important to remember that impact can be positive or negative, and impact can be intended or unintended. So as social innovators or social entrepreneurs, we have to be thinking about, we're trying to create a positive impact, but what might be the negative impacts that get created through an intervention, and are there any unintended impacts that we're creating? And so I guess in practice, what I see that looking like is, a lot of people look at the kind of short-term outcomes of an intervention. So, how many people are employed, or how many kilograms of waste have we diverted, or how many greenhouse gas emissions have we sort of saved. So those are the shorter-term outcomes. And I think sort of in our heads, we can all understand how that's positive, and those are good things. But I think what we really struggle to do as social entrepreneurs and social innovators is to tie those shorter-term outcomes to what the longer-term sort of broader impact those outcomes have actually is. So, what is the impact that having a job has on someone's life? And, is it happiness? Is it their well-being? Is it, increased income? What does that allow them to do? So it's really interesting to try to get to actual impact. Like, what is that longer-term goal and objective? I think that a lot of the stakeholders of social enterprises, so whether that's customers, whether that's funders, governments, they often are only looking for us to report on our outcomes, those shorter-term outcomes. But I think a lot of social innovators and social entrepreneurs are motivated by the longer-term impacts. So trying to connect those two can be challenging work.
That's great. So do you have any examples of that? So where you're seeing that, like even in your own business and what you're doing? Like, so how do you struggle? Because one of the biggest struggles we find is you're exactly right. It's like, okay, what is a measurement of an impact? Okay, well, I've employed 4 people, in 2 days. That would be great. But, what is that, like, how do we then create that as a larger goal moving forward and saying, okay, what have we done? Like, what, for those people, like you say, what does it mean? And what are those examples? Do you have anything like that where you've sort of worked with somebody and said, okay, like we started here and then at this point we're now here, and was there something that you saw that was sort of monumental, but maybe we couldn't measure it, but we should?
Yeah, I mean, so like using the example of Sojo as a starting point, I think this is also really important because as new initiatives get started, it's impossible to measure impact. Like the very nature of impact makes it sort of impossible to measure because it's longer term, because it's these kind of broader effects. You have to have a certain kind of amount of track record, and even the first person that we engaged in a Sojo training program, we might only be starting to really understand the impacts of that now today. So I think that's kind of an important point. Social enterprises, I think, start by counting outputs and counting outcomes, and then are able to make those connections. But for us, we have a vision of unleashing the potential of young people to use business to improve the world. So that is our vision. And I think when we think about impact, we try to go up to that vision. So we think about the different ways that like what that actually would look like to us. What does it mean for a young person's potential to be unleashed? So as an example of how we're trying to create impact measures around our work, we look at, what does a young person need in order to thrive? What skills or competencies do they need in order to thrive in today's rapidly changing world? And so we've been working on building a competency framework that really looks at what those skills are. And the way that we built this framework is by going to the literature. So this is where research really comes in. We, have done research on what are those competencies, how do those get developed, and then how do those competencies get tested. So if a young person, in order to thrive today, the literature says they need collaboration skills, we have to look at how do you measure having really strong collaboration skills. And then we try to integrate that type of measurement into our programs. So if the literature says a young person can thrive if they have this set of skills, and we can point to the fact that we're able to build those skills through our programs, then we can start to say, okay, we're helping young people thrive because this is the connection. The literature is the connection. So that, is to give an example of how relatively early stage organization, how we're starting to think about tying the outcomes that we track to the impact that we ultimately want to create.
Right. So this is where your theory of change, your vision, kind of those, your sort of goals come into play. So it's sort of, you're saying we're doing what we say we're going to do, and then we're going to see how well that kind of rolls out based upon, you're sort of proving the literature in this vein.
Yeah, and I think the reason that we have to rely on the literature, what would be really incredible is we do some kind of randomized control trial where we look at, a group of young people who never participated in a social entrepreneurship program designed by Sojo, and then a group of young people that did, and we see 5 years down the line, what we're able to study sort of longitudinally what they're doing and what impact our training had on them. That's, when people talk about the top of the line ways to measure impact, those are the types of things that they describe. But that's pretty out of reach for a lot of social enterprises practically, just because of resources and skills that you need to be able to implement that type of assessment. So we look to the literature, and we're always refining it too. But I think, the vision, like you just said, the theory of change really guides that, and you are coming back to the vision of kind of what you're trying to create, and that is what has guided our efforts towards impact.
Wow. So that's this is really problematic for funding, right? Because when you look at a traditional funding model, and when you go back to sort of a business framework, so if you do X and Y, we're gonna, approximately get to Z, right? So, my investment in this, I know that I'm gonna get X amount back. So in terms of this impact investing that we talk about, this is pretty problematic. I mean, there's really a lot of risk in what you're doing because, like you say, you're sitting in literature. You're not necessarily sitting in, sort of clinical trials, for lack of a better terminology. So how do investors wrap their brain around this measurement context?
Yeah. So I mean, in my experience, there's a variety of different types of funders and all stakeholders, and their sort of impact evidence preferences are all different. So if you're looking at, as an example, government, a large government sort of investment program where they're trying to drive sort of social outcomes for their population, and they're investing in health solutions, they probably have a very high level of impact evidence sort of requirements. So they might actually expect that you have a randomized control trial because they're giving out huge amounts of money. They expect that your intervention is proven, and that you are really able to prove to a very high level that you're having impact. Then sort of on the other side of the spectrum, I would say that there's lots of individual impact investors, so kind of angels, people who individually are putting their money towards this, as well as sort of competitions, so like pitch competitions and things like that, where because there's a recognition that what they're investing in is earlier stage, and what they're investing in is less proven, they have a lower level of kind of impact evidence requirements, and they might be okay with just understanding your theory of change and, seeing that you have put in place some tools to start to count those outcomes or count outputs even as a starting point. So I think that's important to know. And I also, in my experience, not all social enterprises go, or even social innovations go all the way up to the highest level of impact evidence preference because none of their stakeholders are really looking for that. Also, this challenge is being faced just as much by investors as it is by entrepreneurs. And so they are looking at outcomes. In the majority of cases, I find that impact investors are looking at outcomes as well, short-term outcomes, and not truly long-term impacts. But they generally have come up with some kind of thesis, so like investment thesis. So this is their approach to investing. They believe that if they can invest in 5 ventures that create X, Y, and Z outcomes, they have already kind of put together in their mind their theory of change that those outcomes will lead to the ultimate impact that they're looking for. So I would say that, this is a challenge that everyone is sort of working on together. But also the people who are doing it the best are I think the ones who are most pragmatic about it and think about impact measurement not as just some reporting tool that we need to give into funders and government, but actually as kind of a management tool that helps you make better decisions and move towards having more and more impact. I think that is much more pragmatic, useful, and will actually lead to better outcomes for the venture and what the investor is hoping for as well.
That's great. So what about internals? So what's your experience with working sort of internally? So we talk about the lone entrepreneur that goes out. You talk about youth, they have an idea, they see a gap, they need the funding, they envision the future, someone teaches them the theory of change. But what about organizations that are sort of sitting at the forefront of this concept of social enterprise, whether they're not for profit or they're for profit, and they're breeding entrepreneurs, or they're encouraging entrepreneurs to take a look at, under their model of sustainability? How are they kind of, like, from your perspective, what's going on in that space with this idea of impact?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of pieces there. In my experience, I work on the board of, I sit on the board, I don't work, but I sit on the board of a number of nonprofit organizations. And when I think about, and some of them have either recently started or been operating social enterprises for a number of years. So at the board level, that's kind of where governance sits, and the decisions might sit for whether you pursue a social enterprise or not internally. So if there's that entrepreneur who wants to champion it, you probably need to get board support. And I think that a lot of organizations potentially decide to pursue social enterprise more because of the kind of financial needs of the organization. So they believe that a social enterprise is going to generate some additional revenue that can support the financial sustainability of the organization. Because that is often the motivating factor, I find that the organization can get a little bit lost in only looking at the financial impact of a social enterprise for their organization. It's also an easier thing to communicate and to look at. We have standard accounting principles. People know how to review financial statements. It's more complicated to look at impact and try to review whether something is having an impact than whether it's creating a profit or loss. But I think that's really a challenge that entrepreneurs can drive forward and really think about how they are framing a social enterprise within their organization as not only creating some financial value, but really allowing the organization to address the social issues that they're working on in a new and different way. A lot of organizations also, I think, have created some kind of some sort of intellectual property almost around how they create the impact that they do through their work. And I see a lot of them using social enterprise as a vehicle to almost monetize that intellectual property that they've developed over years and years of addressing a particular issue. So that's an exciting opportunity as well. But certainly, figuring out what are those key and clear to understand metrics so that you can get the internal stakeholders of the organization on board and really see a social enterprise as a way to create new social value, not just financial value, is sort of a key to success.
Right. So you're sort of almost taking this idea of, in the entrepreneurship model of an organization, you're almost sort of having to smash or integrate this concept of maybe more empathy and impact around the humanization of profit, as opposed to, sort of someone who's coming out who's very passionate about what they're doing, and they see the ultimate impact in sort of a less monetized way, and sort of sharing business framework and saying, listen, we kind of have to find some common ground on both of these sides of the spectrum. To say, we can't be too weighted here, or we could, but, we're sort of, it's this balancing act. And I would assume for most organizations and when most entrepreneurs heading out there, these are true collisions that we're running into, and we don't really know how to categorize them as well as we may have in the future.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I think everyone is kind of facing it at once and together. I think that there are some emerging best practices, but there's not one clear way to do it for every organization or for every entrepreneur. And so I would say it's definitely something that people are still navigating. And we probably don't share as well as we could the lessons that do get learned within organizations about how to do that well. So as this class goes out and becomes entrepreneurs, starting social enterprises within organizations, figuring out ways to share those experiences, I think is something that we can all do a bit better.
So do you have anything to share around that? Any experiences that you've had or any learnings that you would sort of, any nuggets around some of this stuff that in your past experiences, or even just with Sojo, some of the things? Like, we've had lots of conversations around sort of as we integrated Georgian, the Sojo platform with human services students, and sort of how they're approaching the platform and different things like that. Do you have anything that, from that perspective of that learning and that sharing, do you have any sort of nuggets that you sort of have an awareness on?
Yeah, I think it's my biggest takeaway as someone who's very motivated by impact, but is like in reality running a startup social enterprise that you're trying to make work and have grow in the right ways. That like just being motivated by impact gets you quite far. You sort of make decisions that are inherently sort of driving towards that impact, but it doesn't get you all the way there. And so you really do have to sort of not rest on your laurels that you're a good person that's motivated by impact and you're going to make good decisions, and those are going to lead to more impact. You really have to figure out how to invest like financially and resources into managing your impact over time and getting better and better about how you're creating an impact. So I think that is something that we have needed to check ourselves on a few times, just because it can fall to the wayside because you sort of think, okay, well, I recently heard someone say, no margins, no impact, which I think is really true. You have to be able to keep the enterprise afloat in order to create an impact. Right. But if the purpose of the endeavor, the enterprise, whether it's within an organization or external one, is impact, then what's kind of the point of doing it if you're not managing that impact and making sure that you're doing that better and better over time.
Right.
So that's one thing. Another thing that I've learned is organizations that do this really well have figured out, in my experience, how to bring the right partners around the table to get the work done. So impact measurement takes a lot of resources to do that deeper, sort of more intensive type of impact measurement that I was talking about earlier. And so, there's one organization in Toronto called Common Ground Cooperative. They run 5 or 6 different social enterprises within this cooperative. They're a nonprofit. They have partnered with a university to be able to get the sort of research skills of some academics and graduate research assistants to actually do the development of their impact measurement framework and do the actual work for them. And that has allowed them to do a full social return on investment sort of research study on their approach to creating impact. And now they have this number that they can go out with, and they say, for every $1 we spend on our programs, we create $7 worth of impact. And so that is incredibly powerful because it's easy to understand for lots of stakeholders. It's really helped them in proving out their kind of social enterprise approach to addressing the social issue that they work on, and comparing that to other approaches and trying to encourage more policy change towards their type of approach. It's really unlocked a lot of potential for them, but they wouldn't have been able to do that on their own. They really needed to partner with, like in their case, it worked at Aberdeen University, but there's all sorts of other organizations that can kind of bring in the resources to do this work.
That's great. So you talked about, so Common Ground went out. So if you're an organization or you're sort of in this position and you want to up your game, what do you think a great pathway is towards that? Now, you talked about creating stellar partnerships, obviously with academic institutions. But as you're sort of navigating through this world of social enterprise and this concept of impact, and your funders and your investors are saying, what's the impact? Where do you start? Like, how do you start as an organization and say, okay, outside of our theory of change and outside of these are the things we're doing, how do we start on this methodology of creating impact?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So there's a couple of tools that I think are really useful for getting started. They're sort of standardized tools. So part of what that helps you do is say, okay, if we are going to go out for support, we're plugging into impact measurement frameworks that are global standards or Canadian standards. And so they have some sort of positive reputation or recognition beyond our work. That's really helpful as an early stage organization because obviously you're just trying to build your reputation and brand. So a couple of those tools, one is the B Corporation assessment. Now, that actual assessment is intended for for-profit enterprises if you actually want to become a certified B Corp. But you can use the assessment and you can get your score and you can get feedback on all sorts of really interesting impact metrics, even if you're a nonprofit organization. It's a useful tool for figuring out, okay, where are we having really good impact? Where could we do some more work? And you can use that kind of a report to be able to make decisions among your team and even communicate with stakeholders. So you go to theimpactassessment.net, I believe, and you just complete the answers of the assessment and get a report at the end. So that's a really useful and easy starting point, I think, because the questions are relatively straightforward and it can be used by kind of anyone. The other set of metrics that is interesting to take a look at, there's two actually. One is called GEARS. This is the Global Impact Investing Reporting Standard. The other one is IRIS. But those two are sets of metrics. It's kind of a database of metrics that impact investors around the world are starting to agree to use to report on the impact of their investments. So as an entrepreneur, you can look at those metrics and say, okay, I'm going to pick, or we're going to pick as an organization, 10 IRIS metrics that are global standards. We know that they have evidence behind them about the way that they're framed. We're going to use these 10 metrics and we're going to collect information on those 10. And then you're able to go to people and say, we're using this global standard reporting framework. We've picked these 10 because they're the most appropriate to us today. And then over time, you can kind of evolve that. So I think using some of those those standards or global frameworks is a really helpful way to get started and to build your kind of credibility in doing this.
That's great. So, and then once you've sort of, you take those as sort of your first layer, what happens after that? So you say, okay, so we're going to pull these together. How does that now relate to sort of moving forward? Again, the theory of change, impact measures. What's next? Like, where do you go after that?
Yeah, so then, I mean, once you pick the metrics, the next step is actually collecting the information. So figuring out what are our collection tools going to be. And so that can be things like surveys, interviews. You can get participants in your program to self-report or your customers to self-report about certain things, or you can have some way of actually testing them. But you have to figure out, what are those collection tools? That can be, easy in some interventions. So if you're bringing people together for workshops once a week or class once a week, you have a lot of touch points with those beneficiaries of your program. And so you can deliver a survey every week and you can gather their responses. That can be kind of an easier one. It can be more challenging to gather information when you're working on something that's a little bit more nebulous, I guess. Like we have an online training platform, and so we're engaging with people to some degree through that platform, but we're sort of one or two levels removed. And so gathering information from them can be more challenging. So figuring out those collection tools, I would say is the next step, and then actually incorporating them into how you are operating your social enterprise. So making sure that everyone knows how to use them and then that they actually get out and get deployed. Once you gather that information back from your collection tools, I think that's where you have the opportunity to sit down again and analyze the information that you're getting in, and then start to look at, okay, what are we seeing from this information? Is anything coming up as unintended consequences or unintended impacts that we had not planned for? Are we doing well? Are we tracking well towards the impact that we're trying to achieve, or not that well? And starting to get really honest with yourself when you're analyzing that data, so that you can go back to your theory of change and say, okay, we made these assumptions about how our program or our intervention is going to create certain outputs, leading to certain outcomes, leading to certain impact. Is the information that we just gathered sort of reinforcing those assumptions, or is it leading us to believe that we might have gone off track somewhere? And this is where, the approach of saying impact measurement is most useful when you're using it to manage the enterprise comes in, because this is where you have the opportunity to actually make changes to either your approach or the way that something's getting delivered, to try to test whether that's going to track you more towards your theory of change or further away.
Right.
So yeah, I think that piece, your theory of change is based on a set of assumptions. And so once you collect, that's where you get to actually analyze and test those assumptions, and then make a change to something that you're doing, or maybe you need to rethink some element of your theory of change.
Okay. And this is really where the overlap of sort of the concept of the business framework and sort of the impact or the social purpose framework works. Because in a lot of ways, they do the same in sort of a profit-driven corporation, but the assumptions that they're making are based upon sort of an economic framework, right? So where are we going to go into the market? Where are we going to create impact? This is more just validating where we're creating that social in the social sort of sphere. So it's interesting to see how, like, sort of using the same tool or the same methodology or the same approach, maybe with different, sort of collection mechanisms, that they really just overlap. It's just you're kind of putting different information into that framework.
Mm-hmm.
So which is interesting, because I guess when it comes to sort of board readiness or organization readiness around this idea of social enterprise or social purpose or sustainability, it's really kind of the same thing. It's just, but you're just using different, you're just looking at things differently, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the more that you can have those two pieces overlap, the closer you're going to get to an enterprise that really does create, or an organization that really does create that kind of long-term financial sustainability with the social or environmental impact, and that those will be truly aligned. I totally agree. And like from that board experience, I think, we have a bunch of dashboards that we look at about our financial performance. And we also do have dashboards about our kind of impact performance. And the key as the, entrepreneur who's trying to champion this is really getting the organization to think about those two things as of equal importance, and figuring out how to make a decision that is informed by both. Right. And what impact will, a decision have on both of the bottom lines, really.
Yeah. So it's interesting. You mentioned a tool called a dashboard. So do you want to, maybe let's just step into sort of the practical side of this impact measurement and talking about the dashboard, because in Sojo, you use your dashboard quite effectively, and you talked about this. So maybe we can talk dashboards just for a little bit. And, how are they constructed? How are they built? What are they for? How do organizations use them? Because we talked about the collection mechanism and then the sorting. A lot of that information does go into a user interface called the dashboard.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. So dashboards can be kind of as low tech or high tech as the organization is comfortable with, I think. Although we recognize that nonprofit organizations, social enterprises, often are resource constrained, and although it's may not be the most comfortable area for people to kind of dive into the technology tools and solutions, this is one area where leveraging technology, I think, is really helpful in managing your resource allocation around doing all that data collection, analyzing it, and making decisions with it. So, on one of the boards that I sit on, the dashboard is really it's a Word document, basically, that gets populated with certain numbers based on surveys sent out to all the management staff at the end of every month. The surveys are sent out using Google Forms. The inputs from the survey get put into a Google spreadsheet. They have a couple of formulas in that spreadsheet to add up certain numbers or to make certain calculations based on the outcomes metrics that the board wants to see. So say they're looking at the employment numbers for people who have accessed their employment services. We might want to see, how many people are reporting that they're full-time employed after 6 months and how many after 12 months. So at the end of the month, the manager puts in the numbers for their department. Say it was 15 people out of 30. It's generally better than that on this board. They do quite well. But say it was 15 out of 30. And then what we want to see as a board, just in a well-presented format that we can easily consume, we just want to see 50%. We want to know 50% of people are in full-time employment post-training. And then we want to see at 12 months, has that number gone up or down? And then we can have a conversation about that. So the dashboard really presents to us the higher level of all the kind of granular information that the management team has pulled together. So like I said, they use really simple tools, Google surveys, Google Sheets, and then they put that into kind of a Word document. Now, there's another organization that I serve on the board of that has a much more sort of sophisticated model for dashboarding, and they're using Office or Microsoft Enterprise kind of software, where they also work in 7 different countries, and so they have country teams reporting in, they have headquarters teams reporting in, and they also pull information from other sources, like how is our social media doing, like how effective are our marketing efforts. So they're pulling in Google Analytics, they're pulling in their Twitter analytics, they're pulling in all of these different pieces of information, and then the software does all of the dynamic kind of presenting of that information into graphs and charts and visuals that we can start to understand.
Right.
And you're able to search them over time, and it keeps a whole repository of this information. So that's a much more sophisticated system for dashboarding. But I think those 2 examples sort of demonstrate, depending on the level of complexity of your organization, the level of complexity of the particular program, the stage that you're at, there are ways all along to kind of meet that need, even if you have no resources. Like the one that the organization that uses Google surveys and Google Sheets doesn't spend any money on that solution. The other organization spends quite a bit. So there's different ways to do it depending on how much you have to put towards it.
Right. And you talk about, you made a really great point about we always have to go back and take a look at our assumptions. And, I think the dashboard is a really great starting point for that in a lot of organizations, like you say, whether it's low or high tech. Because a lot of times I find that, as a board level, you're always kind of looking at that high level perspective. But even for your staff, these impact measures they inform their gut, right? So, it's sort of that credibility to go back and say, well, listen, I'm noticing that, our beneficiaries or our customers are using our programs and our resources in this way, and it's just observational, right? And then you go back to the board, and I think when the numbers are there to talk to that, not only does it, bring this concept of how do we pivot or what's happening, what's trending, it's really important. So it really backs it up. And that's just more anecdotal in terms of using that data. Because like you say, I think organizations sometimes can get so data driven, they lose sight of what, their gut from the front line as what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually that's a really great point, because I think the usefulness of a dashboard is that you can make it open to people at kind of all levels. And like you just said, you might have someone who's working on the front line and saying, okay, well, I see this dashboard that we're gathering, but I don't really think it's capturing X impacts that I'm really seeing when I work with clients day to day. And, you can get that feedback to inform, okay, what are we gathering, and should we be gathering different information than what we are, and also how are we, making decisions about that. And again, like you said, having that dashboard to kind of reinforce a gut or create a conversation with 2 different levels of stakeholders to say, I don't believe that this is actually that accurate of an indicator, but someone else does. Being able to have that conversation is where this work gets kind of driven forward and becomes better. And so dashboards can be really useful for just being able to get all of your stakeholders involved in that conversation.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. Kind of a collision of the dashboard versus design thinking observational work, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's great. Well, no, this is fantastic. Is there anything sort of else that you wanted to sort of maybe touch on around impact or data, or just, giving a little bit of a precursor to what these students are going to get when they finish this off and they hang out with you for their launch pad? Anything?
Yeah, sure. I guess I think one of the last pieces I would say about impact and data is that we didn't talk about too much is it can become a really useful sort of currency to be talking about the work that you're doing. And so, being able to figure out, even in the most lean way possible, and there's an organization in the US called Acumen. They have an initiative called the Lean Data Initiative, something really interesting to check out a bit further. People are interested in this kind of concept of how do we do data and impact in a really lean way. Mm-hmm. But figuring that out from the beginning, I think, creates huge value for your organization over time. And it can be an investment of resources up front, but really trying to communicate to whoever you need to convince that the benefit that this is going to have down the line, and be able to bring in funders, bring in supporters, bring in partners. It's really key. It'll allow you to create way more compelling communication materials, way more interesting sort of stories and narratives about your work. So I guess that would be my last thing to say on that. And in terms of what people will get when they come to my course, so I'm going to be delivering 1008, which is the Launchpad course. And it's quite exciting for me because it'll really be a culmination of all the other courses, but the opportunity for everyone in the program to also take what has been learned not in a physical classroom, in our virtual classroom, but starting to connect that with their communities. So a lot of the work in Launchpad will be around sort of understanding who the stakeholders of your enterprise are actually in your community, and going out and talking to them, and figuring out what experts and advisors in your community are going to support you long term. Being able to get feedback on your impact measurement plan and your financial plan and your operational plan from those experts. And my hope really is that it will be the kind of jumping off point for a lot of the initiatives that have been developed through SENP, to ensure that they have longevity, because the course will be all about grounding you into your own networks. So once you don't have the structure of the course, you have the structure of the networks in your community to support you.
Yeah, no, that's very, very true. It's amazing how, and you talked about this at the very beginning about that drive, right? And how important that is, just outside of the data and the impact measurement conversations. Like, one of the things that, throughout the themes of it is this concept of the entrepreneur, this concept of the drive, this concept of the innovator, right? And I think there's a great line in one of the videos that we watch where, most people have to see to believe, and the entrepreneur truly believes, and then they see, right? And once the structure's gone, it really sort of weeds out, where that passion lies in that individual. And from my perspective, because they take the design thinking class just before yours. So, right? So this concept of creativity and vulnerability come out when you have no resources and you have no tools other than what's inside of you and your own ingenuity. Brings out a lot of vulnerability, I find, in that kind of entrepreneurial space. And where do you dig deep to find that if there's no answer, right? Like, once you leave, like, there's no right or wrong. It's just, okay, let's try it.
Yep. For sure. Yeah, the other piece of the course that I'm excited about is building peer-to-peer support.
Right.
Something that I believe so strongly in. And so, one of the big streams of the Launchpad course will be working in peer-to-peer groups to support one another and figuring out how much, strength you can have just from talking through these issues with your peers, even if they don't have, actually, especially because they don't have some expert opinion they're trying to impart onto you, but instead are just really working through those issues that you talked about, the kind of vulnerability and just the drive and the kind of passion, and they're able to work those through with you. So I'm looking forward to it, certainly.
That's awesome. Well, this has been great, Ellen. Thank you so much for sharing. So we've got about 50 minutes here on our tape, so I'm sure everybody our brains are full, just as mine is, because I always find that, you know, when we talk about some of these concepts and you're learning these things, you get full pretty fast.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, but thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, and of course, if anybody's got any questions, I'm sure they can reach out to you directly, as you are one of our instructors.
Yep.
But yeah, this has been fantastic today, and thank you so much for sharing. And I encourage everybody to take a look. What's and Sojo? So I'm going to get the URL wrong because I always do when I type it in. Where can they go and take a look at Sojo?
They can go to mysojo.co, and you can take a look at the work that we do there. Yeah, and you can, of course, contact me directly as well. I'm happy to chat.
Fantastic. All right, cool.
Great.
Well,
thanks, Nicole.
that's fantastic. Thanks, Ellen.